Welcome to episode 65. I'm Stuart McCullough, I'm the CEO of VHIA. And starting with this week's Industrial Roundup, and in particular with community health, which continues through a period of intensive bargaining. This week we returned to the Fair Work Commission to continue interest-based bargaining with VHIA with the assistance of the Commission with respect to allied health professionals within community health. In addition, we're also meeting with community health members to discuss industrial action for those community health members that are experiencing it. And we also have a further meeting planned with VHIA on Friday. With respect to bargaining and other groups, we have put forward a proposal for settlement to the medical scientists, which is the union that covers dietitians, psychologists and pharmacists, amongst others, as well as a proposal for settlement to the health workers union with respect to health and allied managers and admin employees. With respect to our health services, we've released a bulletin that sets out the schedule for the EBA forums relevant to the doctors in training and medical specialists agreements. These are all-day forums with one agreement in the morning and one agreement in the afternoon with a lunch in between. Members are welcome to attend one or both of those. There will be 2 metro locations and 4 regional locations. As we have done with all the EBAs in this round, we will be taping one of those EBA forums so that in the event that a member can't go to one of the scheduled forums, they will have access to that material. In addition, we will be providing the slides for that presentation and posting them on our website in advance of the forums themselves, so that those members who like to have a printed copy of the presentation notes will have them ahead of the relevant forum. Also this week for health services, we have the dental reference group on Monday, dentists bargaining on Tuesday, an allied health professionals SDPPWG meeting on Thursday, and an SDPPWG meeting for nurses and midwives on Friday. Metropolitan members can expect to receive a copy of the IR report for June ahead of our meeting the following Wednesday. As always, all of our activities are summarised through the VHIA community app. And that's it for this week's Industrial Roundup. Welcome to the weekly update, where we go in depth with a particular discussion. And joining me for this week's discussion is Senior Workplace Relations Consultant Daniel Pullin. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you, Stuart.
Daniel, would you do the honours and reveal the clue for today's subject for discussion?
Of course.
So for the benefit of those people who are listening to this podcast rather than watching, could you describe the object?
Look, it's a Smurf. I'm going to call him Garden Smurf, standing on what appears to be some faux grass, surrounded by some buildings, some pottery buildings.
Wow. So today's subject is Smurf?
It could very well be.
All right, let me cast a little bit of light on this. Say that this building here on the right is Hospital 1. Building 2 is Hospital 2. And we take, you've called that, what's it, Garden Smurf?
Garden Smurf.
I think it's musical theatre Smurf.
Uh-huh.
Give the Smurf a break, he's dressed up. And let's see. Whoop, man down. That's right. He has travelled from Hospital 1 to Hospital 2. On the basis of that clue, what would you say that today's subject for discussion is?
I'd say it would have to be travel allowance.
So close and yet so completely wrong. Today we're talking about rotation, which means we're talking about the Doctors in Training Agreement. So just in terms of rotation, Daniel, for members who haven't come across that concept for Doctors in Training of rotation, could you quickly explain its purpose?
Of course. So the purpose of rotations for doctors in training is predominantly to ensure that smaller health services have doctors in training rotated from parent hospitals, which are ordinarily metropolitan or large regional health services, to meet service demands or as part of a doctor's structured training program.
So a doctor in training has built into their terms of employment with their parent hospital a requirement to rotate to other hospitals.
That's correct. So ordinarily, there are more complex arrangements with respect to rotation, where that's pertaining to a doctor who is engaged on part of a specialist training program through a specialist medical college, or where a doctor's on a general practice training program. But ordinarily, what we would experience is the traditional rotation arrangements from a parent hospital to a rotation hospital.
So just in terms of the use of the term rotation hospital, am I correct to suggest that that's the health service that receives the doctor in training and not the physical act of rotation of the hospital itself?
It's definitely not the physical act of rotation that we've experienced here with our Hospital 1 on the left here. What you have described it is correct, and the definitions of parent hospital, rotation and rotation hospital are contained in Clause 3 of the Doctors in Training Agreement.
Okay, so key definitions located Clause 3 of the Doctors in Training Agreement.
Yes.
So today we're going to be focusing on the most common arrangement, which is where a doctor in training is placed at a rotation hospital for a period of time at the direction of the parent hospital.
Correct.
And I understand that there are a few clauses that we're going to be speaking to today that are relevant to that fact of rotation. So for the benefit of those who are playing along at home and have a copy of the Doctors in Training Agreement with them, which clauses will we be discussing?
So we'll be speaking to Clause 24, which is rotation between hospitals, Clause 52, which pertains to rotation allowance, and Clause 73, facilities while on rotation.
So before we discuss the changes in detail, the agreement refers to Hospital 1 and Hospital 2. What do those terms mean? And feel free to use the props if it helps.
For sure. So the terms are new to this agreement and would be new to the sector, and it's a way to better reflect the arrangements that occur where a doctor moves from Hospital 1, which may be their parent hospital, to Hospital 2, which is a rotation hospital. The reason why we use Hospital 1 and Hospital 2 is because not always is the transfer from a parent hospital to a rotation hospital. A doctor may transfer from a rotation hospital to another rotation hospital. So it's just a better way to reflect the relationship in those arrangements, especially when we talk later about rest breaks between those rotation hospitals.
All right, so now that we've clarified that, let's discuss the changes associated with Clause 24 of the Doctors in Training Agreement, rotation between hospitals. I understand that there were some significant changes to address occupational health and safety issues.
There was. In particular, it was ensuring that doctors in training are provided an adequate rest following their final shift at Hospital 1 and the first shift at Hospital 2, where the doctor is required to move residents as a result of that rotation.
So this arrangement only applies to those doctors in training who are required to move residents as a result of the rotation?
Correct.
And what are some of the examples that were given during bargaining with regards to occupational health and safety?
So during bargaining, we had the benefit of AMA doctor in training representatives that would attend some of these discussions, and they identified some scenarios where Hospital 1 would expect the doctor or garden smurf to perform night shift or on-call on a Sunday night into Monday morning. The doctor, and they would finish at 7 a.m, for example. The doctor was then required at Hospital 2 on Monday morning for their first shift. And the distance between Hospital 1 and Hospital 2 necessitated the doctor moving residents.
So even if it was that they were finishing a little earlier than that, the fact of having to move between finishing at one place and the other being something of a challenge. So in that scenario where a doctor's last shift at Hospital 1 is Sunday night into Monday morning, finishing at 7 a.m, and the doctor's required to move residents for the rotation to Hospital 2, what does the clause require for a break?
So the clause would provide that where a doctor is required to perform night shift as their final shift or otherwise performs an on-call period, the doctor must be provided 48 hours break between completing their night shift or on-call period at Hospital 1 and their first shift at Hospital 2.
Okay, so 48 hours being the key figure there. So under those circumstances, that doctor couldn't be rostered at Hospital 2 until 7 a.m. on the Wednesday. That is 48 hours since the end of the last shift.
Correct.
What if the doctor's last shift wasn't a night shift or an on-call period? What does that require for a break in that scenario?
So in that scenario where the last shift wasn't a night shift and it wasn't an on-call period, but the doctor was required as part of that rotation arrangement to move residents, the doctor is still provided a minimum of one clear calendar day from duty, which includes on-call and overtime between their final shift at Hospital 1 and their first shift at Hospital 2.
So the doctor's last shift at Hospital 1 ceases at 10 p.m. on the Saturday. Would I be correct to suggest that the Sunday is the whole calendar day clear from duty and that the doctor can commence work for Hospital 2 at any time on the Monday morning?
That's correct.
And if the doctor is not required to move residents, these arrangements don't apply?
That's correct. So the entitlement only applies where the doctor is required to move residents as part of a rotation arrangement.
Daniel, I understand that there were some additional provisions really to facilitate joint planning between the parent hospital and the rotation hospital, between Hospital 1 and Hospital 2, to achieve the obligations that are provided for in this clause?
That's correct. So engagement and cooperation must occur between the two hospitals prior to the final roster being issued. And the matters that they need to contemplate are the appropriate rostered ordinary hours for coverage at Hospital 1 and Hospital 2, appropriate on-call coverage, especially during that crossover period, appropriate skill mix for coverage, accommodation arrangements, including contingencies if that doctor needs to stay for an additional day or part day because they performed on-call on the Sunday night into Monday, and reasonable time for the doctor relocate, including time to rest following their shift, vacate their accommodation and travel to their next hospital, and appropriate time to settle in and orientate to their new location.
So the changes that appear to this clause seem to not only address occupational health and safety issues, but provide a blueprint for health services to follow to ensure compliance?
That's correct. So the intention of the parties for these changes will result in greater compliance and safer work arrangements for doctors in training on rotation.
I understand that there are also changes with respect to how location allowance was paid for doctors on rotation.
That's correct. So clause 52, which provides for rotation allowance, in particular location allowance, has been amended to remove the limitation that existed for the payment of the allowance where that rotation hospital had to be greater than 50 kilometres from the Melbourne GPO. So that's now been removed. So location allowance under this agreement is now payable where a doctor is required to move residents.
There were further changes, I understand, to clause 73, facilities when on rotation. Could you summarise those changes?
Look, the existing facilities when on rotation clause has been amended to provide for the provision of a safe living environment, which includes an obligation on the health service to perform safety assessments of residential living quarters that are provided by the rotation hospital.
So just reflecting back on our discussions with the AMA, this is another one of those discussions where occupational health and safety issues were part of the framework for discussion.
Correct. So we discussed in particular the risks that are associated with single or sole accommodation in unfamiliar towns, especially for female doctors in training.
I think that's a good reminder that at this time, more than 50% of doctors in training are now women.
Correct.
So a rotation hospital will be required to perform safety checks on residential living quarters.
That's correct. So the assessment, so the agreement requires an assessment to have regard for all the circumstances involved in that arrangement, including the individual circumstances of the doctor. It also requires that security and any security risks associated with isolated or share accommodation should be considered as well.
I think that's an important thing, just to really reinforce the fact that we expect people to always turn their mind to the issue of safety, and that safety can't be assumed, it has to be considered, it's an active requirement.
Correct.
So I understand that where a doctor is permitted or required to live in the residential quarters provided by the rotation hospital, there's also a requirement to provide reliable internet, including Wi-Fi wherever possible. I assume that's not so much for safety reasons.
No, as we'd appreciate that junior doctors and doctors in training are themselves often training and undertaking additional studies and sometimes a part of specialist training programs. So they still need to keep in touch with their course and their units and their groups that they're working with. So especially in some of our rural and regional areas where doctors are being rotated to from their ordinary place of residence, which may very well be in a metropolitan area, it's really important that they're able to keep up with their training and their education whilst absent. So the importance of Wi-Fi and a reliable internet connection was quite imperative and really an important point for the AMA during discussions on this point.
And there are additional obligations that were inserted with respect to Wi-Fi?
Correct. So the rotation hospital will need to advise doctors in writing on how to access the Wi-Fi that's accessible for those doctors on rotation.
So the provision of information.
Correct. And also technical support contacts if, for example, they can't log on to the Wi-Fi.
Obviously we want people to have access to Wi-Fi, if for no other reason, to give them free access to this podcast.
Correct.
So just to summarise in terms of these changes for doctors in training, we have provisions that are directed towards accommodation and safety, towards the ability for people to access the internet so that they can continue in their study, and practical safety issues around what happens when you finish at one hospital and move to another.
Yes, that's
all
correct.
common sense things, all probably representing existing best practice for a lot of health services, but it does help us to get a consistent approach across the sector.
Correct.
Daniel, thank you so much for taking us through those provisions.
Thanks, Stuart.
When I wake up, well, I know I'm gonna be the man who wakes up next to you. When I go out, yeah, I know I'm gonna be the man who goes along with you.